Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Biotech Project. Here's Scott, half of your team of Scott and John, ready to introduce our next guest for this episode. We're really excited. Again, we've had a lot of success with the last two episodes with our guests, and hopefully, you've been able to listen and download them. They're available on our website at www.thebiotechproject.com, up on YouTube. Of course, you can listen to us on all the major platforms. So we are now on everything from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Just search for the Biotech Project and you'll find us. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to John to introduce our guest for today.
Awesome.
John.
Thanks, Scott. Looking forward to another great episode today. I'm really particularly excited to be with Danny Jones today. Danny is the first of probably many of our medical affairs colleagues that we'll hope to have on the project. Danny has a long history in medical affairs, has been a great friend and colleague of mine over the years, and really, really excited to have him here with us today. And look forward to hearing all about Danny's background and what he thinks about medical affairs in the world of biotech.
Yeah, and I'm super excited about having a medical affairs guest on today. You know, coming from the commercial side, I'm really looking forward to this. So let's listen to the intro and then jump into it.
You want to break into and navigate your career in the pharma and biotech industry. We know how to teach you. This is the Biotech Project. From sales to medical affairs and everything in between, we're talking about it. No matter how you got here, from here to your next role is up to you, and we're here to help. You'll hear from guests in every role, from CEO to sales, recruiters to hiring managers. The Biotech Project. Here are your hosts, Scott Resnick and Dr. John Walsh.
Great. As I said earlier, we're here with Danny Jones. Danny Jones is, as I said, our first medical affairs guest. Really super excited to have him. So without further ado, welcome, Danny.
Thanks so much for having me, John and Scott. This is great. Looking forward to the conversation.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Our past couple episodes, we've talked to people in the commercial world, really learned a whole lot about what their roles look like. Today, what I'd hope to do, if you're good with it, is to learn a bit about you, about your background, but really importantly, as we navigate the biotech project, what our hope is to share with our listeners what they might need to know to be able to either break into or change into a career. One of those careers that's important to us is medical affairs. So, love to hear a little bit about. Maybe you could tell us briefly about you and a bit about your background.
Yeah, no, happy to start with a quick introduction. So, I came to medical affairs really through kind of a basic neuroscience background. So I did a PhD in neuroscience at UCSF, really focused on the mechanisms in the brain that sort of go off the rails as a seizure disorder is developed. So focused on epilepsy. Transitioned into a postdoctoral fellowship at Duke University Medical Center for a couple of years, when I then began to sort of think about how I could leverage my sort of scientific expertise and acumen into a more kind of outward-facing, business-focused role, and that's sort of how I found myself in the world of medical affairs. So began as a medical science liaison, and then sort of moved into a more in-house medical director, strategic lead role, and now I'm in a position where I'm overseeing kind of the global medical affairs strategy as well as the North America medical affairs strategy within the ophthalmology therapeutic area at my current employer. So have sort of navigated a number of different roles in both US focused as well as global focused roles, and then field facing as well as sort of headquarters based. So happy to kind of dive into any of those particular roles and areas that you guys would like to explore.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned that you hopped into the industry through being a medical science liaison or an MSL.
Yeah.
For those people in the audience who aren't familiar with it, maybe you could tell us a bit about what is an MSL, what do they do, what was your day to day like?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one of these roles that folks who are looking to break into the industry with scientific or pharmacy or sort of clinical background will often find themselves in for that kind of first position. So the medical science liaison or MSL role is a field based role generally, in which you are more or less the HCP or healthcare provider facing team of the medical affairs organization. So your role is really to be that field facing representative of the medical affairs organization to address unsolicited questions about either the pipeline or the marketed products, about the disease state in which you operate, and really engage in sort of a peer to peer scientific exchange with clinicians, scientists, and researchers. So that's sort of where folks will often find themselves in that kind of first role. Maybe to take a bit of a step back, it might help to also talk a little bit about sort of medical affairs as a function and sort of what the role is of medical affairs and the overall kind of enterprise level, so that then where the MSL fits maybe becomes even more clear, if that makes sense.
That's perfect. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I think about medical affairs is almost like a Venn diagram. So you've got sort of your circle that is your research and development organization, right? And their job is to sort of discover molecules that will hopefully end up becoming new medicines, to design the studies that it takes to get those molecules from a test tube into people and eventually through the FDA and other regulatory authorities to get it approved. You've got a circle over here that's your commercial organization, right? Your sales, your marketing, commercial strategy. That's focused on sort of how do we generate revenue for the company with this asset that we get approved, so we can continue fueling that R&D engine. But you need folks that sort of straddle both of those boundaries, right? So the overlap of that Venn diagram is how I like to think about medical affairs. So medical affairs is where you'll typically find people with a profile in which you've got sort of strong scientific or clinical acumen, so your MDs, your PhDs, your PharmDs, but can also wear that business hat or look at things through a very strategic and kind of business lens. So you can work together not only with your R&D colleagues, not only with your commercial colleagues, but with external stakeholders, with physicians and scientists, to really make sure that you're delivering kind of the right data to the right person at the right time in support of the pipeline, in support of the marketed products. So that's kind of where I view medical affairs and how it fits into the organization. So then where the MSL really comes into play, I personally think that the MSL is one of the most important jobs, not only in medical affairs, but frankly at any biotech company, because your MSLs are that, field facing, customer facing, if you will, member of the team, in which they are answering those questions, delivering new and emerging data to make sure that your external stakeholders ultimately have the information that they need to be able to make informed decisions. And there's really nothing more important than that, in my view.
So I've got a question for you. I have a ton of questions for you. This is going to be great because hopefully you'll allow us to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and
Yeah, absolutely.
give me an opportunity to. I think folks on the commercial side that are out there, especially on the promotional, so the marketing or the sales part of the organization, have a lot of thoughts and beliefs about medical affairs, some of which may be true, some of which aren't. So I
Sure,
think it would be great to peel back and look behind the curtain on some of those things. But one of the biggest things that we've been talking about, and one of the things that has led to the project here, is how much has changed in our industry in almost overnight. Normally,
yeah,
things take years, if not decades, to change, but we were forced to have quick, rapid change when COVID
right,
hit and created, the current environment. So from a medical affairs side, some of the things I know you guys are dealing with is things like delays from the FDA in looking
sure,
at things. They're not doing in person, or they weren't doing in person inspections of sites, which of course ultimately affects clinical trials and manufacturing and all these other things. And a lot of focus has been put onto things like vaccines and
sure.
therapeutics for COVID. So, what's happened over the last couple of years in medical affairs, and how much of that you think is going to have a permanent shift moving into the future?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really really good question, Scott. The way that I kind of like to think about it is that the pandemic sort of you know compressed the accelerator pedal on changes that were sort of already afoot, but it sort of sped those changes up, right? So there was already, I think, some shifting in the field towards other channels for engagement with external stakeholders. So thinking about digital channels, for example, how can we effectively leverage digital channels, non-personal kind of channels to communicate scientific information with our external stakeholders. So, the MSLs traditionally have been a sort of a face-to-face type of engagement model. I think that's never going to go away. I think there is true value to that face-to-face scientific dialogue and discussion that can never fully be matched through digital channels or virtual channels in my opinion, and call me old fashioned if you want. But I think that, with that being said, the shift to digital was already afoot. It was already happening, and COVID just really accelerated that. So the need to find other channels for that dialogue, both one on one, virtually, much like we're doing now, seeing scientific congresses adopt a hybrid kind of a model, or even going fully virtual, or again this hybrid model where you've got some people who are dialing in, some people who are flying there live, perhaps your kind of platform or podium presenters, and then, of course, you've got medical information teams that are kind of operating in a more kind of virtual environment, providing information sort of in close to real time as you possibly can to physicians who are asking questions. So it's really just been, I think, a shift in sort of prominence, and sort of kind of the distribution of activities across channels and shifting more towards digital. But I think face to face is really here to stay, and it's starting to come back. Certainly in ophthalmology, we've got a lot of scientific meetings and congresses. They're fast and furious, and we've seen those really coming back in full force over the last year or so. So I think that's not going to go away, but we have to continue to adapt and get creative, and find other ways to take advantage of technology to communicate our science.
Danny, it's funny you mentioned that. I was just at a Congress meeting this past fall, just before the end of the year, and people were so excited, not only just to be at a meeting and be able to exchange
Yeah,
information, but to be live and see colleagues. So I think your point, can't be, misunderstood. That being live and having that live interaction is definitely going to have a place. I think there's the yin and the yang of the whole thing, right? I think in some ways
sure.
it can make us much more efficient, right? Things we used to have to wait for, we can pull together an advisory board quickly.
Yeah.
We're able to work at different times of the day. We're able to be a little bit more focused, but yet still, hopefully, we get that balance back as things move forward. Yep.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the advisory board piece is a really excellent example of where this shift may in fact be permanent, right? When you pull together external experts to sort of come together in a room, provide feedback that the company needs to inform its development plans, its launch or commercialization plans, its evidence generation plans. Traditionally, to your point, John, that's been you fly in on a Friday evening, you have dinner, you get together on Saturday all day. You hope and pray that your flight home on Saturday night isn't going to be delayed, even though it usually seems to be, especially if it's in Chicago. And so, people are kind of think they're happy to be over it. Honestly, I think people are excited to get to come home, have dinner, and then put the kids to bed if they're young and they're going to bed early, and then you get on your laptop and have a virtual discussion with your colleagues and provide your feedback that way without worrying about flights and hotels and things like that. So I think that aspect of it is absolutely here to stay, and I think it's a change that's for the best.
You know, something else that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So we all saw a few weeks ago the news about Pfizer having a big change in their commercial footprint.
Sure,
And one of the things that the experts, if you will, the folks that in the investment community kind of went back to is that they feel there's going to be a shift to taking some of those FTEs and put them into medical, where
sure,
you can still get that face to face, and you might be able to have an impact. And Justin Van Ness, who was a guest on our show from Sales Ops, talked about how those decisions are made, and they really come down to mathematical problems of
sure.
where the budget needs to be placed. So, are you seeing any signs of that? Is there this sudden, um, rush to increase headcount in medical affairs to make up for some of these changes?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it really varies by therapeutic area, by field, by specialty, right? So, uh, to the extent that there is kind of intense competition for share of voice with a given external stakeholder, you have to be that much more strategic about who you deploy and when you deploy them to sort of secure that share of voice. And if you've got, two or three different field facing roles that are sort of trying to get at that same individual, is your message going to be diluted? And if a given stakeholder says, well, I met with person A over here in sales, so I don't have time for person B over here in medical affairs until maybe 4 or 5 months from now, that can create challenges, right? So I think it depends on sort of that therapeutic area landscape and to what extent there's competition for that share of voice. With that being said, though, I think companies that are more resource limited, right? So earlier stage companies, companies that aren't generating revenue or that are just in kind of the nascent stages of generating revenue, and they've got to be really thoughtful in where they deploy their dollars and cents. Look at the compliance framework around what a medical affairs employee is able to say from a reactive kind of scientific exchange standpoint versus what those guardrails might be on a commercial person, and sort of make some trade-off decisions about where that dollar is going to go. So I think I wouldn't say that I've seen it sort of happen necessarily suddenly where I've worked, but certainly you do see those assessments and those kind of shifts coming into play, especially in the more competitive markets or at companies that just have more resource constraints.
Now, Danny, one of the words that Scott mentioned was investment bankers, and I know from other
Yeah,
discussions we've had in the past, part of your career was a brush with trying to decide: do I take
yeah,
my academic career into the banking industry, or do I take it into pharma? So
yeah,
maybe you could tell us a little bit about why they would look for someone with the scientific background in banking, what that role could look like, and then maybe why you
sure.
chose to go the pharma route.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it was one of those real inflection points when I had that decision to make. And I sort of knew it was a really, really important one that I would always look back on. And I hoped I wasn't going to make the wrong decision. And I think now looking back, I'm obviously really, really happy with the direction I went. But it certainly wasn't a decision that I ever expected I'd be making when I was in the lab, recording transmission between neurons, right? So I had sort of decided after about a year or so in my postdoc that I wanted to look elsewhere. I had really good funding. The research was going really well, and in spite of all that going really well, I felt a little bit bored in the lab. I felt like I was looking for something that had more, kind of variety in the work day to day, that was more externally facing, where I could really observe a more direct kind of impact in what I was doing, and really having to think big picture, right? In science, you kind of get narrower and narrower and narrower the further you go. And so I began to look for opportunities where I could sort of shift my mindset and sort of look at things through a different lens. So at the time, one of the big Wall Street banks was looking to actually bring in PhD scientists without finance backgrounds to actually come in and join equity research groups at the bank, covering biotech and pharma stocks, right, and taking that sort of scientific acumen to help assess and analyze biotech and pharma companies, and understand their clinical programs, understand likelihood of success. Is there some solid grounding behind the kind of biology that they're leveraging in their clinical programs, to ultimately make projections, right, about where these different stocks were going to go. And so these are incredibly smart folks who work on these teams who have a wide variety of backgrounds, but the common thread is that they're all very analytical. And so I think that this bank really saw potential value in bringing in PhDs with that analytical mindset and the scientific acumen, to sort of infuse that thinking into the team. So went up to New York, from our home in North Carolina, went through kind of a battery of interviews, and ended up with an offer. And at the same time that was happening, I had actually been contacted by a recruiter through my LinkedIn profile. And I would certainly, people would roll their eyes at me when I said I had a LinkedIn profile as a postdoctoral fellow, right? It's not something that academics, at least back then, were as into. So you can call me an early adopter of that, maybe. But yes, there you go. So, and timing is everything. So a recruiter reached out to me from a company that was getting ready for a new product launch in epilepsy, which is, of course, my specialty. They had an opening in the Mid Atlantic region where I was based, and they really needed a candidate with deep expertise in relationships in epilepsy to come and really help to drive this launch. And when the recruiter contacted me and said, "Have you ever thought about being an MSL?" My answer was, "You're going to have to tell me what those letters stand for first, and then we'll see." So he explained what the role was, and as he talked about the MSL being kind of that scientific and clinical expert who's going to break down and communicate that science in a way that's sort of meaningful to external stakeholders, like clinicians, and having to sort of look at things through a different lens and be able to adjust on the fly and like get exposure to drug development and thinking cross functionally. All I could think of was, I can't believe people get paid to do that job. That seems like just a dream job. That seems amazing. Uh, so I said, yeah, let's kind of take this forward and see where we go. So I was interviewing for that role in parallel, and actually I did not get that job. So the offer was actually made to someone they had found at the last minute, who a phenomenal guy that I ended up working with, who had years of MSL experience, was based in a different city where they were hoping to find someone. And they had said, listen, it was a split decision, 3-2 vote, but we really, really liked you, but we found this really seasoned candidate. And said, all right, no hard feelings. I really enjoyed the experience, love learning about it. It's basically ready to take the banking job. And then got a call a couple of days later from the pharma company, and they said, our Boston-based MSL just resigned to take a new opportunity at another company, and we weren't lying when we said we really liked you. We'll relocate you and your family up to Boston if you're willing to accept the role. And so that was kind of a little bit of, serendipity. And so then I all of a sudden had a really hard decision to make. And at the end of the day, what really kind of drove the decision for me was this desire to stay really close to the science, to have an impact by helping to sort of bring innovative new medicines to physicians and to patients, and just to start to get myself, deeper, more exposed into how that process happens from beginning to end. And so ultimately decided to take the MSL role, move up to Boston, and 10 years later, here we are.
Wow. So I've got, it's interesting to hear that story. And I think circling back around to kind of some of the things that are going on in this new direction that may be coming. What was interesting is when I was exploring career opportunities, I actually had a few calls from companies about a position in medical affairs, a field based
Okay.
medical affairs position, without having the PhD background, but having had a experience in areas that were, very, science based,
Right.
so and that was really interesting. I had never seen organizations being willing to take in people into field medical affairs positions that didn't have those, additional letters after their name. Now,
Right.
some of it may have been, I have been a medic for a number of years, so there is that, which one of the people knew me from that. But I thought that was interesting, and it was almost exciting. And the one fear I had was, well, if you move into that, does that limit where you can go? Because really, to get
Sure.
at the higher levels, you probably do need those other initials. So, what's your thoughts on that? Is that something that just maybe a one-off kind of thing, or do you think that that's something that, as these areas grow, is being looked at?
No, I mean, listen, to me, effective medical affairs teams, and actually just forget medical affairs, effective teams in general, are diverse teams. And diversity can mean a lot of different things, of course, but one of the uh, sort of ways in which I think diversity is really important is diversity in backgrounds. I've worked with just phenomenal medical affairs professionals who have a master's level degree in a basic science, or who otherwise don't have that that terminal degree. And I think as long as an individual has an ability to sort of understand the basic science, the mechanism of action, and the clinical trials, and sort of communicate that in an effective way, I don't see that necessarily as a limitation. Now, it varies, I think, based on role as well, right? So medical affairs is sort of a very wide ranging term that encompasses not only, your medical science liaisons, not only your medical directors and your strategic therapeutic area directors, like sort of where I sit, but medical information, publications, medical communications, medical operations, right? And so within that, you've got a huge variety of backgrounds and people who do and don't have those terminal degrees. And the other thing that I would say, and sort of as a trend that I've seen in medical affairs and in the industry, is a greater acceptance of diverse backgrounds and different roles. So I will tell you that the job that I have now, and frankly, the jobs I've had for a number of years, ever since I moved in house into a more kind of medical director sort of leadership role, those were typically roles where you had to have an MD, right? Where it was almost exclusively physicians that held those roles, you know. And certainly when you get to the VP level or SVP level, these department leaders were almost always MDs by training. That's not how medical affairs teams look anymore. You've got PharmDs, PhDs, and MDs in all kinds of different leadership roles. My manager, who is the SVP for Global Medical Affairs, is a PharmD. My U.S. medical director, who leads our U.S. medical strategy, is a PhD. My publications lead is a PharmD. We've got a huge variety of backgrounds. We've also got MDs on the team as well. And I think that diverse teams are stronger teams. People look at things through a different lens. When John and I have worked together in former lives, we each bring a very different perspective to a given problem or challenge that we're facing. And I think that's a huge strength. So I think that not just sort of judging a book by its cover or sort of making a snap judgment based on the letters after someone's name is something that leads to higher performing teams.
Yeah, I think you're right, Danny. And I think as people are evaluating jobs, it's important to, as people are interviewing or investigating, I think it's important for people to understand if there is some form of, I guess you can call it degree bias at a particular
Yeah,
organization, because there are definitely some organizations that only want a particular set of skills in a particular role. And I guess that's okay. But
sure.
I'm sorry, to Scott's point earlier, if you go into a role and you know that the subsequent roles that potentially could follow require you to have education and training that maybe you don't have now, you either need to decide you're going to get it, or maybe you realize that might not be. So I think it's really good for people with different backgrounds to know that as they come into roles, because we've all seen people frustrated by the fact that they really are totally capable of doing that next
Yeah.
role. But because that organization has the belief that only one particular degree takes that role, it can be a challenge. So I think it is a really good question for people to ask.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
no, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
Go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to
I was
say,
going to say that the kind of the cross functional piece is important, right? So I think in organizations like that, if you end up sort of in a role where you feel like you've sort of topped out because you maybe don't have the right degree or whatever it might be, uh, that's where you look to move cross functionally potentially, right? And I think breadth in your career ends up serving you really, really well in the long run, getting exposure to different departments. And it's actually much easier to sort of make those transitions across departments and functions relatively early in your career. And as you progress and advance, it becomes more and more difficult to make those moves. So I think that can also be seen as an opportunity, really. If you feel like you don't have the right degree, the right letters after your name to sort of make that jump, that's where you start to look and say, what other kinds of diverse experience can I get at my current employer that will just make me that much stronger of a candidate for leadership positions down the road? And maybe it won't be in the function that you're in right now. Maybe it'll be in business development, right? Or maybe it will be in commercial strategy. I've seen people make all those kinds of moves from medical affairs. Maybe it'll be into clinical development, right? I know people who've made that transition very successfully. So I think that's one of the things I would also keep in mind.
So I guess the question, and I can ask both of you because obviously you in your position, and John in previous positions have led medical affairs teams. Can somebody in the front of the organization on the commercial side, somebody in the field that happens to be really good and knows uh, the science and within an organization, make that transition, even albeit temporarily, into a medical liaison role without having that degree? Is that something that people who like science and are on the commercial side now can think about as an option, or do you think that that's probably not the best direction for somebody to think cross functionally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes the right kind of mindset to do it, right? So number one, it's about sort of that scientific acumen first and foremost is your foot in the door, right? So can you really understand a clinical trial publication, a basic research publication, up, down, backwards, and forwards, right? So you can engage in that really peer-to-peer level dialogue with your external stakeholders. And if you can meet that bar, whether you're in a commercial role or any other role, then that's kind of step one. I think specifically in the context of someone looking to make that move from commercial, the questions that I've asked when I've sort of been in the position that I'm evaluating a candidate like that are really geared towards understanding the ability for that individual to shift his or her mindset, right? The way that a thought leader liaison or a sales representative uh, behaves and performs is tied to very specific incentives, right, and objectives that they're supposed to achieve, so that they can kind of reap those rewards. And that's completely different on the medical affairs side. And so what I'd really be looking for is someone who understands very strategically and very in depth the role that medical affairs plays, and that demonstrates to me they have the flexibility to shift their mindset from how they've been used to thinking and acting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question of whether you can make that move is so independent, or is so dependent rather, on the organization, what their culture is about, how willing they are to adapt a different profile of an individual. And to Danny's point, it has to do with the individual and how he or she is able to adapt their skills to be able to do it as well. So I don't think it's a definite, I don't think it's a definite no. I will say it's probably farther and fewer between with fair
Yeah,
balance, but there's exceptions to every rule. In fact, I think Danny and I can recall an individual at a prior company who was in a commercial role for many years, had interest in getting into medical, slowly started to move that way. And to the discussion we were having earlier, realized that if he wanted to stay in that role for a longer period of time, he needed a terminal degree. So, using his tuition reimbursement plan from the company we were with, ended up earning a PhD. And so while he was kind of in the job, earned his PhD and then continued on into that role. So, just because you don't have the degree, if you are able to get into that role, doesn't mean that if you do need the degree down the road that you can't do it. And even better, if a company is able to sponsor you through a program, all the better. And it shows the commitment, I think, and it makes people excited about being in that role. Yeah.
That's a great point. I didn't even think about that using, and it's interesting because in one of my first jobs in industry, there was somebody that went from the field and then was able to go all the way through law school sponsored by the company. And then
sure.
part of that, they transitioned into a compliance role as an attorney for the company. So that's a good reminder for anybody to look for that benefit. Danny, one thing you mentioned, I think it's a great transition, is the difference between the mindset of commercial versus medical affairs. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about cross functionalism, and this is where I think we really pull that curtain back. So,
Yeah,
coming from the commercial side, right? Depending on the organization, there may be a a steel barrier between commercial and medical, and then others,
right.
have kind of adopted to what I think my personal thought is the best practice, where you find a way to work together within the compliance means. So um, what's going on in the industry now? Are you seeing any shifts there? What's your thoughts on that? And how can commercial interact with medical in an effective, compliant way that benefits everybody?
Yeah. No, this is always a hot topic, and I think there's a couple of different levels we have to look at this at. One is at kind of the global level, where you're talking about kind of strategic alignment across functions. And then one is more like at the local or regional or even like field level, right? So maybe kind of two lenses through which we can kind of look at that question. So going back to that first one, I mean, the strategic alignment across functions is absolutely critical. I mean, we usually kind of talk about the three M's, right? Medical affairs, marketing, and market access, right? So these are collectively the strategic leadership kind of functions at the global level that are ultimately going to drive the commercialization strategy and the launch strategy for a given asset. And those functions have to absolutely be aligned on the strategy. And there's no sort of compliance sort of concerns with making sure that you're aligned across functions on the strategy, provided that those strategies are in line with the data, in line with the label or the anticipated label, and ultimately the interest of the company, the interest of the patients, and the interest of the physicians have to be aligned for a product to be successful, right? And so you need to be operating with aligned strategies in that kind of space. And so that strategic alignment, going back to even the earlier phases of drug development, becomes very, very important for a product to be successful, right? If you don't have that alignment across the three M's, and then really drive that alignment with your clinical and regulatory teams who are ultimately leading the studies and leading the registration and leading the drug approval, you can find yourself with a product that doesn't have the right data to get reimbursement, right? And the data that your clinical team or that your medical affairs team might be generating might not actually be the data that a payer needs or that a clinician needs. So it's critically important to have that strategic alignment on where things are going to sit across medical affairs, marketing, and market access, and that happens kind of at the highest levels of the organization, and then really needs to sort of trickle down throughout the organization. So then but where I think sometimes there can be challenges is at that regional or local or field level, right, where you've got your local leadership, you've got your MSLs, and you've got your sales reps who are kind of in the field, and that's where I think, to me, uh, modeling like consistent and compliant collaboration from field leadership is the most important thing that an organization can do. What quickly leads to situations kind of spiraling in a bad way is where you've got inconsistency, where you've got maybe one region where an MSL and a sales rep are maybe sharing so much information that you're starting to have some concerns around compliance, right? And then you have another region where it's a total steel wall, firewall, whatever you want to call it. And people talk, so they know if there's a lot of information being shared over there, not so much information being shared over there. And that's a problem for organizations. So it really comes down to field leadership and local leadership really setting clear expectations on the what and the how of kind of information sharing and of compliant collaboration. And I think that organizations that get that right, those are the organizations that are going to do well.
Yeah, and if I could just even build on that a little bit, Danny, some of the things that I think as leaders we can share, and we have shared in our prior roles, is making sure that whichever role you're in, that you have a respect of the function that you're working with, right? So when we're working with medical teams, as an example, we make it very clear to say to the medical teams, you need to respect the fact that our commercial colleagues have a job to do, and that's to go out and sell their product, right? And we have to be aligned with the strategy. We have to be able to be there to reactively answer the medical questions that come our way. We have to be able to provide the resources that we're asked to bring from key opinion leaders or from prescribing physicians so that they can help best prescribe the product. That happens as a two-way street, right? So great sales leaders that I've worked with have also educated the sales team on the fact that the MSLs and the medical directors that occasionally go into the field have a job to do too, and there are limitations. As an example, proactive sharing of information will generally be on label. If someone has a reactive question, we're happy to provide that information. We're happy to provide resources, and I think a lot of times where the rub comes is when the other function doesn't believe that someone is supporting the mission, or working together. But a lot of times it just boils down to educating, this is okay to do, but this may not be okay to do, and making it not feel like someone's not trying to cooperate, but rather having everyone understand what they're able to do and not.
Yeah, and having been on the commercial side, I've had I've been lucky to have really great medical affairs counterparts, and I think it comes down to effective communication. That's really what it comes down to: understanding, number one, the right way to communicate, right? Avoiding things that might get you in trouble and talking about things that you shouldn't, and knowing where those lines are is really important. And just having that conversation, has always been something I found effective. So, so where are things going moving forward now? I mean, we've got a lot of drug development and really kind of very personalized medicine companies that have ultra rare diseases, things that if you 20, 30 years ago when I got into industry, if you told me that, a company was going to develop something for a patient population of 200, I would have thought you were, you know, out of your mind,
Yeah.
maybe participating in your own personal experiment. So, but that's obviously where things are getting really exciting now is in this, highly personalized, um, small population um, medicine. And the flip side to that is obviously it's very expensive to treat those patients and to develop there. So, what's coming? In general, what do you see going on? Where are there future opportunities for people that are seeking, new roles and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, for me, just looking at this through the medical affairs lens, specifically, what I really see the kind of the field moving to is much earlier and earlier involvement of medical affairs in drug development. So to your point, Scott, as companies are looking for new therapeutic areas to enter, however big or however ultra rare they might be, getting the sort of expert input from medical affairs as early as possible in the drug development process is what sets programs ultimately up for success. And so, one of the trends I've definitely observed that I think is really a win-win for physicians, for patients, for industry is that earlier involvement and building medical affairs teams out earlier and earlier and earlier in the process. And so you have not only medical director roles, scientific communications roles, but even field-based, MSL roles coming into play much earlier in the process. And I think it's just a really exciting time to be in medical affairs, and joining kind of a pipeline team is a really uh, cool experience as well, because you're just that much more exposed to everything that goes into or feeds into the drug development process, which is just incredibly fascinating. It's one of those things that it, I pinch myself, right? Because it's just to make sure I'm not dreaming, right? It's such a fun job to get to be so involved in these kind of difficult questions that organizations grapple with, of how do we target this ultra rare population, and design a trial that will, secure not only approval but also access, right? And these are questions that can't be answered in isolation. You need strategic input from medical affairs, from access, from other functions as early as possible to make sure that your drug development program is set up for success from the beginning.
No, so true. Really well said. And if you were thinking today, as we kind of come towards the close of our episode, knowing about what we're trying to do here, with the biotech project, if you had to give advice to people looking either to get into medical affairs or shift their career within medical affairs,
Sure.
what are a few parting thoughts that you might have, really to help people think about what they should be lining up to do?
Absolutely. No, it's a great question, John. I mean, I've had plenty of these conversations with folks who are looking to break in or looking, to make a shift. And I always ask people first to really put themselves in the position of the hiring manager for a few minutes before they send in that email or that resume or go into that interview, and really think about, what is the value that you're going to bring to that role and to that hiring manager, and make sure that you've got a very clear answer to that question, that is one that you understand, that is credible, and that you can summarize in a 1 minute, 3 bullet point answer. If you're not prepared to do that, then you're going to be in trouble when it comes to that interview, right? Because, let's say that you've got you're a researcher, you're looking to make that first move into industry, I always advise folks to look for roles within their wheelhouse, right? So look for roles in the therapeutic area where you're already an expert, where you've already got relationships, where you already go to those congresses as a researcher, because it makes that transition so much more smooth. And you can come into that interview and really be very clear about the value that you're going to offer to that organization. I'm a published scientific expert in this field. I understand the KOLs, the key opinion leaders. I understand the field and where it's going. And so yes, I might not have those those experiences yet within medical affairs, but I've got a clear sense of sort of the value that I can bring really from day one. And then the flip side of that is also doing the homework beforehand to understand, even if you've never done a medical affairs role before, you've never been an MSL, and you're interviewing for that first MSL role, do those informational interviews to understand really what is the role of the MSL and what is the value to the organization. Because if I have a candidate in front of me who hasn't done the job yet, but they've got the therapeutic area expertise and they've done their homework and they know what the job of the MSL is, they know what makes a good MSL, what makes a great MSL, what makes someone successful, that shows me that they're ready to make that transition. And I've not hesitated to hire folks like that without experience over really seasoned MSLs who don't have the therapeutic area knowledge and who maybe didn't articulate what the value of an MSL is quite as well as that person who really did their homework. So I think if you've done your homework, you understand the value that you yourself are going to bring and you can articulate that, then you're going to be set up for success to make that transition.
Awesome.
That's awesome. I've got one last behind the curtain question for you, and I think it'll be a good way to wrap it up. So, one of the things that I think is always a tug of war between commercial and medical is just how much information you guys actually know about what's going on versus what commercial thinks you know or may not know. So I think we've all been victim of a great phase 3 trial that we thought was going to change our career trajectory at an organization, and then suddenly it goes south. And then we all hear when the market hears. So a lot of people, I think, on the commercial side tend to believe that the medical side is aware of everything from the day that first patient may have failed. So
Right.
what's kind of the let's wrap it up with that if we could. What's the truth? What do you guys, what part is medical affairs taking in the clinical trial, the data side? Let's just dispel any rumors for anybody that may be listening. At what point do you guys hear things and are able to communicate it, and how does that work within a commercial or within an organization?
Yeah, so Scott, what I would say is I would kind of hark back to the conversation we were having a few minutes ago around information sharing between medical and commercial and collaboration and how different that looks at the global level versus at the regional or local or field level. And so what I would kind of anchor to is the assumption ought to be that those folks who are in kind of global strategic leadership roles are going to be the closest to those types of data, to those types of decisions, right? And typically what I would say is that it's actually at a fairly similar time across commercial and medical affairs at the global level that the functions will be read in to important new developments in a trial or things like that. Because I think at a healthy organization that understands the value that each of the three M's will bring, there's an understanding that we need the global commercial perspective, we need the global medical affairs perspective, and we need the market access perspective on these new developments as they happen. So I've typically seen is at the global level, it's really very consistent across the board, across the functions, when you're sort of brought in, into the tent, so to speak, for those analyses, for those decisions, to help write those press releases and kind of get them out. And then when it comes to the regional level, that's where you've got the biggest teams that are out sort of customer facing and where there's the most sort of risk and where the organization needs to be the most careful and thoughtful in the how and the when it's communicated. But typically, the communication cascade, I think, at many organizations is fairly well aligned from a timing perspective, because the last thing you want is to put anyone in a position where they've got that deer in the headlights look, right? And they're getting asked a question because a clinician saw a press release that morning, and then you have, whether it's an MSL or a sales rep who goes in 2 hours later and is caught flat-footed because they didn't get the training, they didn't get the resources in advance or just in time. So to me, yes, medical is going to get deeper into the weeds and into the details, because that's where we live, and that's part of the job, and that becomes really, really important. But the high level developments, I think they need to cascade from global to regional to local in a fairly kind of aligned timeline to make sure everyone has what they need to do their jobs effectively.
So the message for all of our commercial listeners is don't think anybody's hiding something from you. When the time is right, everybody gets to hear. So it's not a conspiracy.
Exactly. There you go. Exactly. There's a lot of discussions happening to figure out when does everyone need to know and how do they need to know. And hopefully, if all goes well, the people who are making those decisions have their heads screwed on straight and the execution goes well and everyone gets what they need just in time to do their jobs.
So true. Well, Danny, listen, as we wrap up, I just want to say, first of all, thanks for being here. Most importantly, thank you for taking the role in medical and to forego the role in banking, because we have appreciated not only this hour with you, but the time that we've spent together in industry. So thanks for that. And we wish you all the best. And thanks for spending time with us today.
John, Scott, thanks so much. This was great.
Yeah, and Danny, from representing the commercial side of the duo here, it was really enlightening to kind of be able to dig in with you and hear a little bit about it and understand your role a little better, because I think it's going to help everybody, especially those that are trying to get into the industry and break through. I know the other half of our duo here, Dr. Walsh, he came into industry because I worked with him on the commercial side, and so there is a way for the two to work together and end up moving on in their
He
industry.
dragged
So
me to the dark
thank you
side.
so
Yes, he
much.
did.
Thank you so much for joining us. And for those listening and watching, make sure you check out the episode page on our website at thebiotechproject.com. All of Danny's info is on there, his LinkedIn. If you want to connect with him, I'm sure he'd be willing to, answer any questions that you had. But check out that page for his bio and all his information. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we can't wait to bring you the next episode next week.
You've been listening to the Biotech Project. Scott and John have 50 years of combined expertise, with roles that have covered everything from frontline sales to senior vice president of medical affairs. Scott and John are industry veterans, equipping you with knowledge from guests in every role from CEO to sales, recruiters to hiring managers. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and we hope you've gotten some useful and practical information. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, check out the website at www.thebiotechproject.com. And for questions and comments, send an email to hosts@thebiotechproject.com. See you next time.